Margaret sat in her favorite armchair by the window, watching the young couple next door struggle with their groceries. At 73, she'd lived through enough decades to recognize the pattern. The sideways glances, the hurried conversations that stopped when she approached, the way people seemed to dance around certain truths about aging. The morning had started like any other. She'd shuffled to the kitchen in her worn slippers, spoken aloud to her late husband's photograph as she made coffee, and spent 20 minutes searching for her reading glasses that were perched on her head. But today felt different. Today, she finally understood why her daughter's visits had become shorter, why her neighbors offered polite smiles but avoided real conversation, and why even her closest friends seemed uncomfortable during their weekly coffee meetings. It wasn't about her health. She was remarkably independent, living in her own home. It wasn't about her mind. Her emotional wisdom had never been sharper. The realization hit her like a gentle but firm wake-up call. She developed habits that made others uncomfortable, habits that no one had the courage to mention. Senior empowerment, she'd always believed, came from honest self-reflection. Life after 60 had taught her that wisdom wasn't just about what you know, it was about how willing you were to keep learning, even when the lessons stung a little. Margaret had spent decades helping others navigate their challenges, offering guidance and support with the kind of emotional strength that only comes from weathering life's storms. But somewhere along the way, she'd stopped examining her own behavior with the same clarity. The couple next door had finally made it inside, their laughter echoing through the thin walls. Margaret remembered being their age, remembered the energy and optimism that seemed infinite. She also remembered making assumptions about older people, thinking she knew what aging would look like for her. How wrong she'd been about so many things. She reached for the notebook she kept on her side table, the one where she jotted down observations about life, people, and the small moments that others often missed. Today's entry will be different. Today, she would write about the 12 habits she'd noticed in herself and others her age, the ones that created invisible barriers between generations, the ones that slowly pushed people away without anyone saying a word. Margaret understood that growing older gracefully wasn't just about maintaining physical health or staying mentally sharp. It was about remaining open to uncomfortable truths, about having the courage to change even when change felt impossible. Her pen hovered over the blank page as she considered where to begin. The first habit was already crystal clear in her mind, one she'd witnessed in herself just that morning. But as she prepared to write, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see her daughter's car in the driveway, arriving earlier than expected for their monthly lunch. Would today be the day Margaret finally asked the question she'd been avoiding? What am I doing that's pushing you away? Margaret set down her pen and smoothed her cardigan, the same navy blue one Richard had bought her for their 40th wedding anniversary. 3 years had passed since his funeral, yet she still found herself setting 2 coffee cups each morning before remembering. Life after retirement had unfolded nothing like the golden years brochures promised. Without the structure of her teaching career or Richard's steady presence, she'd had to rebuild her entire sense of purpose from scratch. The early months of widowhood had been a blur of casseroles from neighbors and well-meaning advice about staying busy. She'd thrown herself into volunteer work at the library, joined a book club, and even tried senior yoga classes. But somewhere between finding purpose in these new activities and learning to navigate the world alone, she developed patterns that felt natural to her, but apparently unsettling to others. Her daughter Sarah had been patient at first. The weekly phone calls gradually became bi-weekly, then monthly visits replaced spontaneous drop-ins. Margaret had attributed it to Sarah's busy life. Raising teenagers while managing a demanding job required enormous emotional resilience. But recently, she'd begun noticing the same subtle shift in other relationships too. At the grocery store, she'd catch herself monopolizing conversations with cashiers who clearly wanted to serve the next customer. During book club meetings, she realized she'd been interrupting discussions to share lengthy personal anecdotes that seemed to kill the energy in the room. Even her longtime friend Dorothy had started suggesting they meet for coffee less frequently, citing a mysteriously packed schedule. The hardest part about senior reflection was acknowledging that some changes weren't about physical limitations or memory lapses. They were about habits that crept in so gradually she hadn't noticed them taking root. Margaret had always prided herself on being socially aware, someone who could read a room and respond appropriately. Teaching high school English for 35 years had honed those skills. Yet somehow, in the vulnerability of aging, she'd lost touch with that intuitive understanding of social boundaries. She remembered the woman she'd been at 40, 50, even 60, confident in her ability to connect with people across generations. Back then, she'd been the one others sought out for advice, the teacher who could relate to both struggling students and concerned parents. Now, at 73, she felt like she was speaking a language that others no longer wanted to hear. The irony wasn't lost on her. After decades of helping young people navigate social complexities, she found herself stumbling through the unspoken rules of aging in a youth-focused world. Perhaps that's what made this moment of recognition both painful and necessary. If she could identify these 12 habits, not to judge herself harshly, but to understand how connection worked differently now, maybe she could bridge the growing gap between herself and the people she loved most. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Margaret glanced at the clock. Sarah was indeed early, and from the urgency of her knocking, something was clearly wrong. As she made her way to the door, Margaret's mind raced through recent conversations, searching for clues about what might have prompted this unexpected visit. Had she said something during their last phone call? Had she overstepped a boundary she wasn't even aware existed? Sarah stood on the doorstep, her expression a careful mixture of determination and apprehension. Behind her, Margaret could see her grandson Tyler waiting in the car, scrolling through his phone with the practiced indifference of a 17-year-old. This wasn't their usual monthly lunch. This felt like an intervention disguised as a family visit. "Mom, we need to talk," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used years ago when discussing difficult topics with her own teenagers. The role reversal wasn't lost on either of them. Margaret had become the one who needed difficult conversations, the one whose behavior required addressing. The shift in family dynamics felt both sudden and inevitable, like watching a season change overnight. As they settled in the living room, Margaret noticed how Sarah positioned herself, not in her usual relaxed spot on the couch, but perched on the edge of the armchair, ready for a difficult conversation. The distance felt intentional, protective. Margaret's heart began to race as she realized this wasn't going to be a gentle discussion about whether she was eating well or taking her medications. "I've been talking to Dorothy," Sarah began, and Margaret's stomach dropped. "And to the librarian where you volunteer. And to Mrs. Chun next door." The methodical way Sarah listed these conversations suggested weeks of planning, of building a case. Margaret felt exposed, as if her private struggles had been dissected by a committee she hadn't even known existed. The late-life choices Margaret had made, trying to stay connected, attempting to remain relevant, fighting against the invisibility that seemed to come with aging, had apparently backfired in ways she was only beginning to understand. Each attempt to engage more deeply, to share more of herself, to offer her hard-earned wisdom, had somehow created the opposite effect. The very habits she developed to combat isolation were the ones driving people away. Sarah pulled out her phone, and Margaret saw a list of notes. 12 number points. Her daughter had actually cataloged the behaviors that were causing problems, had turned Margaret's unconscious patterns into documented evidence. The sight of that list made aging with dignity feel like an impossible goal, something that required a rule book she'd never been given. "Mom, I love you, but we can't keep pretending these things aren't happening," Sarah continued, her voice cracking slightly. Margaret realized that her daughter was struggling too, torn between loyalty and honesty, between protecting her mother's feelings and addressing behaviors that were affecting everyone around them. The weight of this conversation would determine whether they could find their way back to each other or whether this growing distance would become permanent. Before Sarah could continue reading from her list, Tyler suddenly appeared in the doorway, his phone clutched in his hand and his face pale with shock. "Grandma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I just got a message from someone who's been looking for you. For like 30 years. The room fell silent. Margaret felt her heart skip as Tyler held up his phone, showing a social media notification that made no sense in the context of their current crisis. Sarah's carefully planned intervention suddenly seemed insignificant compared to whatever her grandson had discovered. It's from someone named Elena Rodriguez, Tyler continued, his teenage awkwardness replaced by genuine concern. She says she was one of your students, and she's been trying to find you since 1994. Something about a letter you wrote that changed her life, and how she never got to thank you properly. Margaret's hands began to tremble. Elena Rodriguez. The name transported her back 3 decades to a classroom filled with restless teenagers, to late nights grading papers and writing personalized notes to struggling students. Elena had been one of the quiet ones, a girl dealing with family turmoil who'd submitted a heartbreaking essay about feeling invisible. Margaret had written a lengthy response, sharing her own story of overcoming self-doubt and encouraging Elena to pursue her dreams despite the obstacles. Sarah stared at her mother, the intervention list forgotten in her lap. "Mom, what letter? What's Tyler talking about?" The irony of the moment wasn't lost on Margaret. Here she was, being confronted about habits that pushed people away, while simultaneously learning that her words had been searched for across decades by someone who'd been profoundly impacted by her connection. The contradiction felt surreal. At the same time, she was failing to connect meaningfully with the people closest to her. Evidence emerged of her ability to touch lives in ways she'd never fully understood. Tyler read from his phone, his voice gaining strength. "She says she became a social worker because of what you wrote to her. She's helped hundreds of kids over the years, and she credits you with giving her the courage to believe in herself. She's in town for a conference and wondered if she could meet you." Margaret looked between her daughter and grandson, seeing her life reflected in their eyes from completely different angles. Sarah saw the troubling habits that had developed in recent years, the ways aging had changed her mother's social awareness. But Tyler had stumbled upon evidence of her lasting impact. Proof that her instinct to connect deeply with others had once been her greatest strength rather than her most alienating weakness. This rediscovery after 60 felt like finding a piece of herself she'd thought was lost forever. Maybe the problem wasn't that she cared too much or shared too deeply. Maybe she'd simply forgotten how to channel those impulses in ways that honored both her wisdom and others' boundaries. Perhaps healing family bonds meant remembering who she'd always been at her core, then learning new beginnings that honored both her past strengths and present challenges. Margaret looked directly at Sarah, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Before you read that list, I need to tell you something. I already know what's on it." The admission surprised them all, including herself. "I've been watching people pull away from me for months, and I finally understood why this morning. But I was too afraid to ask, too proud to admit that I'd lost my way." Sarah's grip on her phone loosened, the carefully prepared intervention dissolving into something more vulnerable and real. "You knew. I knew I was talking too much about Richard to people who barely knew him. I knew I was giving unsolicited advice to store clerks who just wanted to do their jobs. I knew I was interrupting conversations with stories that made everything about me." Margaret's voice grew stronger with each confession. What I didn't know was how to stop, or even if I wanted to. Being invisible felt worse than being annoying. Tyler set his phone on the coffee table, Elena's message still glowing on the screen. "But Grandma, this lady says you saved her life. How? Is that the same person who monopolizes book club discussions and tells the mailman about my medical appointments every day?" Margaret finished with a sad smile. "Because grief and loneliness made me forget the difference between connecting and clinging. With Elena, I listened first, then responded to what she actually needed. Now I talk first and barely listen at all. This life's turning point after 60 wasn't about choosing between being social or becoming a recluse. It was recognizing that wisdom with age meant adapting her natural empathy to honor others' time and energy, not just her own need for connection. The 12 habits weren't character flaws, they were misdirected strengths that had lost their way. Sarah reached across the space between them, covering her mother's hand with her own. "Mom, why didn't you just tell me you were lonely? Why do we have to get to this point?" Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a release she hadn't experienced since Richard's death. Because admitting loneliness felt like admitting defeat. "I thought if I could just be more helpful, more engaged, more present in everyone's lives, I wouldn't feel so forgotten." The emotional closure she'd been seeking wasn't about fixing her habits. It was about acknowledging the fear driving them. "You're not forgotten," Tyler said quietly, and something in his teenage sincerity broke open the last of Margaret's resistance. "You're just trying too hard to prove it." In that moment, Margaret understood that the path forward wasn't about suppressing her caring nature, but about trusting that she was worthy of love without having to earn it through constant giving. The woman who had once changed Elena's life was still there. She just needed to remember how to listen with the same intensity she'd been using to speak. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat across from Elena Rodriguez in the same coffee shop where she'd once overwhelmed the barista with stories about her late husband. This time, she asked Elena about her work, her family, her memories of that difficult teenage year when a teacher's letter had made all the difference. Margaret listened without interrupting, asked follow-up questions, and shared her own experiences only when Elena invited her to. The 12 habits she'd identified were still there, but they transformed from unconscious patterns into conscious choices. She still loved telling stories, but now she paused to gauge whether her audience was genuinely interested. She still offered advice, but only after asking if it was wanted. She still mentioned Richard in conversations, but as a way to connect with others' experiences of love and loss rather than as a demand for sympathy. Sarah had started calling more frequently, not out of obligation, but because their conversations had become mutual exchanges again. Tyler had even asked Margaret to help him with a school essay, trusting her to guide without taking over. These small shifts felt like life's quiet victories, proof that change was possible even when it seemed impossibly late. Elena had shared something during their meeting that stayed with Margaret long after they'd hugged goodbye. "You taught me that being seen and heard was a gift I could give others," she'd said. "I spent my whole career trying to pass that forward." Margaret realized that her teaching instincts had been right all along. She'd simply forgotten that real connection required making space for others to be seen and heard too. The notebook by her armchair now contained different entries. Instead of observations about other people's shortcomings, she wrote about moments of genuine connection, small acts of kindness she'd witnessed, and questions she wanted to ask friends rather than statements she wanted to make. Senior resilience, she'd learned, wasn't about maintaining the person you'd always been. It was about having the courage to evolve while honoring your core self. Margaret still lived alone, still missed Richard terribly, still faced the daily realities of aging. But loneliness had loosened its grip because she'd stopped trying to fill every silence with her own voice. She discovered that the spaces between words were where real intimacy lived, where others felt permission to share their own stories. The timeless lessons she'd learned couldn't be rushed or forced. They required the kind of patience that only comes with understanding that every stage of life offers its own form of grace. Margaret had found hers not in avoiding the ugly habits of aging, but in transforming them into bridges toward deeper, more authentic connections. At 73, she was finally learning to age not just gracefully, but meaningfully, one conversation, one moment of genuine listening at a time.